So firstly, thank you so much everyone for coming out to join us tonight. I know it's very rainy outside and I thought a few people might cancel because of that, but it looks like most of you are here, which is fantastic. So yes, thank you so much for coming, and thank you also for the work that you're each doing in this space as well. So with me I have Chris Elston, better known as Billboard Chris, and he is a Canadian father of 2 girls who has gained prominence from his advocacy in protecting children against harmful medical transitioning in the form of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgeries by sparking conversations with his billboards around the world. Chris and I actually met at a conference in London last year, and when he told me that he was coming to Australia, I remember thinking, that would be fantastic because despite the best efforts of a lot of you in this room and a lot of others in Australia, Australia really is trailing behind the rest of the world when it comes to the child transition issue. When I met Chris, the conversion bill in New South Wales hadn't actually passed. As most of you here will know, it got rammed through in March this year. What it does is that it effectively embeds gender conversion in our laws in New South Wales. It effectively makes it illegal to quote-unquote change or suppress a person's gender identity. And while the law here may have some exemptions and may not be quite as bad as Victoria's, which, let's be honest, is a low bar, it doesn't adequately protect health practitioners and parents. And the reality is gender identity should never have been in the bill in the first place. It's effectively equivalent to gender dysphoria, which, as we know, is a serious mental health condition, and so it shouldn't have been in there. So tonight, Chris and I thought the best use of our time, given that a lot of you are involved in this space in some way or another, would just be to do a bit of Q&A together. So I'll kick it off. Like I said, we'll kind of try and keep it sort of short and sweet so you can just have time to mingle. And then John Ruddock will say a few words afterwards about an initiative that he's working on in this space. So, Chris, some of you here will have seen Chris's videos that he posts on Twitter, which get millions of views, about the work that he does advocating with his billboards on the street. It's obviously quite a confronting thing to do, especially given the culture that we're in, and you sort of open yourself up to all kinds of abuse. What made you decide to do this in the first place?
Well, I'm a boy of the 80s, so I don't worry about a little bit of abuse because we're teaching children that they're born in the wrong body. I grew up before the internet when we all played outside, and it's very clear that what's happening today is a social contagion affecting kids who are just having distress. There's no such thing as a gender identity. This is a lie. When I have asked people on the streets, and I've asked this question more than 1,000 times, to define what gender identity is, nobody can tell me. The left has redefined the word gender to mean something else entirely from sex. We used it as a synonym, perhaps a more polite synonym for the longest time. But for them, this is a performance of stereotypes associated with each sex. So if a boy wants to bake and dance and play with dolls, apparently that puts him on the girl spectrum of gender. We know this is ridiculous. And guess what? Everyone on the left knows this is ridiculous too, because when you point that out to them, when they say that roles are one of the determining characteristics of gender, and then you point out a specific role, like I've just done, boys playing with dolls, boys who like to dance, they'll all say, oh, no, that's ridiculous. Yeah, it's not that. Okay, well, you just told me it's roles, so then what is it? And they can't tell you. Because this whole thing is based on nothing. It's based on regressive sexist stereotypes of what it means to be a boy or a girl. And the positive message we should be sending is that there is no right way to be a boy or a girl, that they're beautiful just as they are, and they don't need drugs or scalpels. But this whole field of gender, they use confusing terminology that has been very successful in confusing the entire Western world, and they conflate it with sexual orientation. So this bill that was passed, this conversion therapy bill, it's a complete misnomer. It's the conversion bill. Historically, children with gender dysphoria grew up to be gay. A majority of them. All the academic studies that were done before they gave kids puberty blockers all point to this same conclusion, The vast majority of them grew out of this distress they were feeling, gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder as it used to be called, and a majority grew up to be gay. So what they're doing today is they're telling these same kids that they're really trans. They can't define what being trans is, but these kids come to believe that, yes, I'm trans, I was born in the wrong body. What an abusive thing to tell a child that they're born wrong, that they need to be something they're not. Can you imagine someone telling that to you when you were a 13-year-old girl or a little boy? You're supposed to be something you're not, and you're going to kill yourself unless you transition? This is what they say to all of them. They push this lie that all these kids are dying. So the whole thing is just abusive, and what we need to do is educate the population, little bits at a time, and we need to bring this, with this, we need to bring some positivity. Because if you just complain and you're just fighting all the time, that doesn't resonate with a lot of people. But when you give this positive message that our kids are perfect just as they are, that there is no right way to be a boy or a girl, that resonates with everybody. They all agree with it. They have no objections to that. And so we just need to keep educating a little bit at a time, because especially when parents find out what's going on, they're outraged. They're hiding in schools all throughout Australia that their own child, your own child, could have a new name and pronouns. And they hide it from you. They treat you by default as though you might be abusive to your own child. This is totally outrageous. They don't do this with any other issue. They're already mandatory reporters where they have to contact CPS if they think there's abuse going on in the home, but this is the one issue where they treat parents as abusers. So I could rant all night, but more than 90% of the population supports these messages that you see up here. I've had 20, 30,000 conversations out on the street and at university campuses all across the world, and it's the same everywhere I go. So we have public opinion on our side. We need to stop being afraid to speak about this issue. Just speak about it truthfully and with compassion. Don't exaggerate because there's no need to. Truth is already stranger than fiction. And as I say, one conversation at a time, we're going to put an end to this child abuse.
In the interest of time, I might open it to the floor straight away. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask Chris? Lucy? I might bring the microphone over.
Sure, then we can hear.
Thank you so much, Chris, first of all, for coming to Australia. I think it's something that we desperately need. In your estimations, why do you think, considering that the trans population amounts to about 0.01%, how has this community's ideology been able to successfully infiltrate our governments, our medicine, and all of these really important clinics that are supposed to be taking care of these children?
I guess I'll come grab the mic. Yeah, thanks. So the percentage is much higher than 0.01 now. That's 1 out of 10,000. You go to some of these schools, it'll be 1 out of 30. Kids identifying as trans or non-binary. This is a social contagion primarily affecting girls. I mean, just the other day, I was at Federation Square in Melbourne. On that one day, in 3 hours, I probably talked to 10 individuals identifying as trans. The next day at the University of Melbourne, I was there for 2 hours, and 4 men who identify as trans came up to talk to me. The numbers have totally exploded. There was a report today, Bernard, maybe you know what I'm talking about. It showed since COVID, the numbers were up 2,000% or something. It was crazy. But this is going on in every school now because they're teaching it in school. And if you teach kids something, if you teach them that gender identity is real and that some kids are trans, well, of course, some are going to believe you. And the kids overwhelmingly affected by this have autism, have suffered sexual abuse. I spoke with the president of the American College of Pediatricians. They're the good pediatrician body in the United States, not the one pushing this. He's still a practicing physician, a practicing pediatrician. He estimates 60% of these kids have suffered sexual abuse. And when you read the stories of the detransitioners, it's the same theme over and over again. And a lot of these kids are growing up to be gay. A lot of them have suffered trauma. A lot of them are in state care. It's the struggling kids. And they're struggling and they're not fitting in. And this ideology is being presented to them as the reason for why they're not fitting in. And they get immediately love bombed. They get affection. So you have a kid who's not fitting in, doesn't have a lot of friends, and then they go to this club at school, Gender and Sexuality Alliance, after school club, whatever it's called, and now they're getting love bombed. They're getting attention. It feels good, of course. And this is being presented as the reason they don't fit in. And it's not just at schools, it's online. I talked to a mother at the University of Melbourne the other day. She came to see me. her 19-year-old son has cut off all contact with her. This has been going on for years, but he fell into this through online gaming. Because all these kids are playing video games online. These boys are playing video games 6-8 hours a day. And he was into anime, which is also a hotbed for this. If your kid's into anime, you've got to get them out of it, because that's one of the primary drivers of this. All these kids are into anime and trans stuff. But this boy got indoctrinated by other people he was talking to through video games. And he got a boyfriend who wanted him to be trans, and you know, it's just a big mess. Porn is involved a lot as well. There's a huge porn problem. So this is coming from a million different angles, to be honest with you, including through the school system's comprehensive sex education programs, where they bring in third-party companies to teach children, and they get into all the extremes of all of this. And if you have a girl who's struggling, who's been sexually abused, and she's not loving being a girl right now, and you give her some out where she can just opt out of her sex, instead of just wearing baggy sweatshirts and hoodies, now she can become a boy. And they're given this false promise that all their problems are going to go away, but they don't. They just end up sterilized, missing body parts, and orgasmic, lifelong pharmaceutical patients with the same problems they had before. Thanks.
You said this has been pushed by the left. What do you think the ultimate goal or agenda is?
So yes, this is pushed by the left, not all of the left, of course. And so I know we have some MPs in the room. When it comes to politics, for the Conservatives, they need to speak up boldly about this. First of all, figure out how to talk about it. It's not that difficult. I used to think there was more to gender than there is. There's nothing to it. There are boys and girls, men and women. That's it. And we've all known this since the dawn of humanity. But the far left has essentially taken hostage the entire left. And the more moderate leftists won't speak up against this, because then they're deemed to be anti-LGBTQ. And those 5 letters paralyze people. And that's how this was able to really grow as much as it did, because there was this big battle for gay rights around the turn of the century, and pretty much all across the West by 2010, these gay rights battles were won. But all the LGBTQ nonprofits, with all of their government money, they don't just close the doors and say we achieved our objectives. They have to keep the money flowing, they have to keep everyone employed. So the new civil rights issue became trans rights. And what we're doing is taking what is a mental health issue, gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, really it's all these other things. All these kids today don't have gender dysphoria. They have other things going on, and gender dysphoria is being falsely labeled as their problem. But this became the new civil rights issue, and no one would say anything about it. And combined with social media, which is very new, really, most people didn't have a social media account until after 2010, or around that time. This exploded. And this generation of kids have been guinea pigs, not only for this trans stuff, but with social media. They're being raised online. Dr. Phil in America, he gave a talk with Joe Rogan recently where he said, really it was around 2010 where kids stopped living their own lives and they started watching other children live theirs. And again, for the misfits, for the struggling kids, they're not the athletic ones, they're not the college football players or Aussie rules football players. They're struggling and they find their friends online now. And this ideology is just growing and growing and growing. So combine that with the silence and the fear that we all had of talking about this, it really had an uninterrupted growth streak. But finally, people are getting the courage to speak up, because these lines of racist and transphobe and misogynist and all these things that the left uses, those don't have the power that they once had. Go ahead and call me whatever you want. Kids are getting caught up and sterilized. You call me whatever names you like.
Can I just ask a little second supplement?
Sure.
I mean, we've heard broadly, your beliefs, but was there something specifically that made you turn from a dad to a guy carrying billboards around the streets? Was there some real crunch thing?
Well, so I didn't change from a dad. I am a dad.
Yeah.
This is what I know, I'm just playing with you.
Yeah, all right.
This is what a dad does today.
I imagine a hockey suburban dad in Canada to someone who now travels the world and does what you do.
Well, I'm a dad of 2 girls, and it's primarily girls affected by this. And The human mind is very easily manipulated. As a species, we go along with all sorts of crazy things. The inventor of the lobotomy won the Nobel Prize in medicine. They stuck ice picks through your orbital sockets and stabbed away at the prefrontal cortex of your brain. Nobel Prize. Some people with schizophrenia or whatever, I guess, calmed down. Wow, that's medicine? And we think we're this advanced society today because we have all this technology around us. But psychologically, we are the exact same as humans who lived in caves 10,000 years ago. We have not evolved. Our psychology is the same. And this is just the latest mass delusion to grip the globe. And I know we're going to look back at this not in 100 years, but in 10 years and say, what the heck happened? The ideology itself will take longer to defeat. We can stop this medical abuse very quickly because we have evidence all across the world now. And to be honest, we've had it for a long time. And Bernard here, everyone should follow him because he writes as eloquently on this topic as anybody in the world. Yes. But, you know, the political class and all that, they like authoritative reports. So we have the Cass Review now out of England, 388 pages, a 3.5-year review. We have systematic reviews of all the scientific literature that have been done in Germany recently. Before that, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway followed suit. The Academy of Medicine in France has said very positive things in our favor. You know, they admit that none of the kids who identify as trans, you can't tell which ones are going to grow out of it or not, but that the vast majority do grow out of it. So we just need to leave these kids alone and get back to the positive message that they're perfect just as they are. And if they still are having distress into their adult years, well, we need to treat them with a holistic approach, as Dr. Hilary Cass has said. It's not gender, you know, you don't just hit everything with the gender hammer to solve all these problems. There's a lot going on. Oh, but you asked why I got going. Well, I'm a dad of 2 girls, and we cannot send our children into this world.
Did either of your girls consider
No.
doing it? It was just,
No, they're not.
Just something that came.
They're not affected at all. I just saw this for what it is. I see this as essentially a cult that has captured all of Western culture, and I wanted to learn about it so that they wouldn't fall into it. And they're fine. I don't have to worry about them. They're straight A's, athletic, all that. They're just thriving in life. But we cannot send our children into this world that doesn't know what a woman is and that's trying to change the sex of children. I don't like this world for them, so we have to fix it. And I'm going to be a granddad one day, hopefully sooner than later, maybe in 10 years. But I don't want my grandkids growing up in this either. So when you become a parent, your objectives change. It's not about you anymore, it's about the legacy you leave for your kids. So we have to change this world.
Do you think there's an element of transhumanism in this movement? Because they're creating people who are essentially going to be sexless. And I worry for what the future holds if we've got 30% of the population in 10 years' time that are essentially sterile and sexless. Do you think it's a post-human thing as well?
Yeah, I don't think our percentages are going to get that high, but absolutely there's a transhuman element pushed by some people in this. Most people aren't aware of that. But transgender ideology is kind of transhuman in a way. It's saying that sex doesn't matter, that you can just change your sex. But when you look at some of the original funders of this, like a billionaire named Martin Rothblatt, this man was the founder of XM Sirius Radio. I think he did XM and then they merged. But he's a transhumanist. He has a robot made in the image of his wife. And he thinks that one day he'll basically be able to upload her consciousness into it so that we can live forever online. So yeah, you get some of that stuff going on. But this is just a really strange ideology that teaches people that they've redefined what it means to be a man or a woman. And they didn't consult the general population. This ideology floated around academia for decades. People like Judith Butler pushing this idea that our gender is performative. For them, it's just a feeling. But how do they know what it feels like to be a woman if they're not a woman? And is a woman a feeling? No. You feel different than her and her and her. Our sex is defined ultimately by the gametes we produce. It's not a choice, we just are. And as soon as you give people a choice in anything, well, some of them will now want it. We just have to get back to reality and stop giving people this choice, because it's not a choice. We're the sex that we're born, and that might not be fair, but that's life.
Hey Chris, thanks for the work you do. It's great. Now you're in the public sphere, the seasoned campaigner. I'm wondering if you can translate any of your learnings from that into the professional spheres. Like I'm a GP, and our college has a special interest group that causes the whole college to jump up and down to their tune. I don't imagine being able to go into their college office with billboards, but anything that you think would be helpful?
Again, it's education. People are confused. They don't understand what's happening. So we just have to have these conversations with people and educate them a little bit at a time. So as a GP, as a doctor, I would forward them the CAS review. I would send them articles from Finland or Sweden about those systematic reviews. You can go to the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, segm.org, and there's great stuff in there. But we just have to educate people. The one thing that is always said by the advocates for child transition, literally every conversation, is that kids will kill themselves if we don't transition them. So we didn't have proper data to, I mean, I could debunk this all day long with all sorts of different data points, but we hadn't had a clinical study done until recently, just within the last 2 months out of Finland. They looked at 23 years worth of data from 1996 to 2019. More than 2,000 kids attended the gender clinic, and most of them weren't getting the puberty blockers and hormones. Back then they didn't do that when this started. But they looked at 23 years worth of data and they compared them to a control group of more than 17,000. Over those 23 years, 7 suicides. 1 every 3 years. And the suicide rate was the same as the control group. And the common denominator was kids in the control group were having mental health difficulties, obviously. Same thing with the kids at the gender clinic. It was other problems in their life. It wasn't gender. So it's just a total lie. And that's really the only way you can justify the physical harm they're doing to children is you say, well, you can have a dead daughter or a live son. And it's the most coercive, manipulative garbage possible. So we need to educate people about that stat because they've been lied to. And the other lie is that puberty blockers are reversible. Every single time. How are they reversible? Is time reversible? They say they buy children time to explore their gender identity. That's a sales pitch. Anyone in sales here? I was in sales. I was an investment guy. This is just a sales pitch. That's all it is. 98% of these children go on to the next step, the cross-sex hormones. Because when they start puberty blockers, they're not exploring their gender identity. They're all in. They've already bought completely into this. And they don't want just puberty blockers. They want to look like the opposite sex. So then they go on to the cross-sex hormones. Oftentimes they start both at the same time. And then the surgeries. And we're talking about children. And then they get to be 25, and they're lonely, and they're sterilized. And as the endocrinologist at BC Children's Hospital said, this was exposed in the WPATH files that were leaked. Michael Schellenberger has this great report. My friend Mia in Ottawa, Canada, actually wrote the report. But as this endocrinologist said at BC Children's Hospital, he follows these kids into their 20s. And they get to be 25 or so, and boy, they want to have kids, of course. This is instinctual, but they can't, because they've been sterilized. And he says so callously, yeah, the dog's not doing it for you, is it? As though having a pet is a replacement for having children. But guess what? They keep doing this to kids anyway. And they know the statistics. They know most of these kids grow out of this. These are really ideological people. And just because they're doctors doesn't mean they're immune from cult-like thinking. They're just the same as everybody else. And a lot of them are making money on this. A lot of unethical doctors have existed throughout history, of course. And we just have to keep getting the truth out there. So just keep having these conversations. And if they have an objection, just handle the objection with the facts.
Hi, Chris.
Hey. Hi.
Hi, welcome to Sydney. We are so fortunate to have you. I'm just wondering, you probably noticed all the colourful presence in Melbourne in particular. I think there's no better person to ask about the best arguments you've come across to get through people with those knee-jerk sort of cognitive dissonance style resistances to the truth in this. And I was just wondering what the most efficient arguments that you put forward in your experience have been.
So first of all, my objective is to reach what I would call the normies, the people in the middle. I don't really worry so much about the people yelling at me, because they're not there to have a conversation, they're there to win a conversation, and you're never going to change the mind of an angry person in that moment. But there are strategies for these people who are hostile or on the fence. First of all, say things they agree with. When you say things they agree with, it confuses them. They think I'm evil. Children cannot consent to puberty blockers. He's a terrible bigot. Oh my gosh. And I'll say, first of all, children are beautiful just as they are. There's no right or wrong way to be a boy or a girl. We shouldn't put them in some stereotypical box. Roles and stereotypes don't define them. These are all statements that the most rabid leftist will agree with. So in that moment, you've created this beautiful thing called cognitive dissonance, which you just mentioned. They're now struggling with this disturbance in their mind where they're competing with two separate thoughts, two oppositional thoughts. They thought I was evil. Uh-oh, he just said a whole bunch of things I agreed with. They have to make sense of that in their minds. They're going to go home and try to make sense of this. But like in a cult, people self-police their own thoughts. They don't allow themselves to look at the evidence. And it might take years before they allow themselves to confront this, because for them to come on over to our side would be to blow up their entire social network and their entire belief system, and that's too much to confront for most people. But the other thing to do with them is just to ask them questions. You'll see it in my conversations all the time. I'll ask them, I'm really confused about what it is that makes you transgender. Can you please define gender for me? I don't get it. And just pause and let that silence sit there, because now they have to come up with an answer, and they can't. They'll say things like I said earlier, it's roles, it's the color pink, it's having nail polish, it's having long hair. So if a boy wants to have long hair, is he a girl? That's how you respond to that. Well, no, of course not, because this whole thing doesn't make sense. It's all fake. So ask questions, say things they agree with, and just leave them confused, because that's a great outcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I might grab and ask you another question.
Sure.
As a CEO of a women's organisation, I better ask this. And also, even though everyone here is more or less involved in the gender critical space, I think people probably have different levels of information in terms of, different aspects of it. So what I wanted to ask you is about, you mentioned earlier the overrepresentation of girls who are presenting with gender dysphoria, who are turning up to gender clinics. You obviously have 2 daughters of your own. So based on the evidence that's out there and based on your own experience being a father of 2 girls, what is it about girls that is making them more vulnerable and more susceptible to gender confusion and gender transition?
Wonderful question. So girls, and we're speaking in generalities here, of course, girls tend to be more empathetic. This preys on their empathy. They're taught that this is helping children to be who they really are. They're taught in school and in university that kids are killing themselves. They're lied to and told that puberty blockers are reversible. And they tend to struggle a bit more with puberty. They're getting sexualized by men. Their bodies are changing more. I give public talks all the time, and I'll ask the women in the audience, and I'll do the same thing here right now. Which women here loved going through puberty? Right, none. So this is just a tough time. And a lot of girls, I would say the majority of girls would say they were tomboys growing up. And then life changes fast, and it's not the most fun period of time, but we all go through it, and we grow up, and women grow up to love their bodies and feel confident. But there's another part to the female psyche. If you look at the big 5 personality traits, one of them is agreeableness. This is the desire for social harmony, and women tend to score higher in agreeableness as well, so they don't want to disrupt as much. And so it just naturally plays on their psyche a bit. It's nothing new that social contagions affect girls. Bulimia is one in more recent history that affected them. This was not a big problem until it was written about. It was first diagnosed as an actual thing, put in the DSM, and it was written about by, I forget, it might have been Time magazine. But as soon as the media wrote about it, whoosh, it took off. This is the exact same. The media wrote about trans. You know, Bruce Jenner has a lot to answer for. Caitlyn Jenner, whatever you want to call him. This show, I Am Jazz, this reality show in the United States, following the saga of child abuse that this little boy was put through on a reality show. And it was popularized in the media. And if the media just told the truth about this, it would end tomorrow. But they won't, because they're corporately owned by people with agendas, and they're pushing this agenda. So we just need to improve our messaging for young girls. Honestly, we just have to continually send them the message that they're beautiful just as they are. That if they don't match the beauty standards of today's culture, and it is harder because of social media as well, and the Instagram culture and all this sort of stuff, we got to keep them off social media and just give them confidence, because the ones who are struggling, this is being presented as an option.
Chris, during the same-sex marriage campaign here in Australia, the LGBTIQA+ activists said that changing the definition of marriage would not lead to children being indoctrinated into gender-fluid ideology. That obviously wasn't true. Now we're seeing examples of bestiality being taught in respectful relationships courses in schools, as we saw in Renmark High School in South Australia just 3 weeks ago. Last year, World Pride was here in Sydney. They were advertising on a government-funded website bestiality-themed parties as part of World Pride. Where does this end?
Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I'm not a Christian, just for all those people who think I'm a Christo-fascist now. This is the natural and the only path of queer theory. So queer theory is the belief, the practice of making whatever is currently deviant and abnormal and normalizing it. And as soon as something is made normal, well, it's not queer anymore, so then the next sexually deviant thing needs to be normalized. And the slippery slope is unfortunately real. Now, we have to stop conflating LGB with TQ+, because people are gay. Nobody is trans. Transition is something you do. It's more accurately termed body modification. It's something you do, it's not something you are, but it's been made into this identity label. The Q is just queer theory, which includes bestiality, includes pedophilia. I don't know what's wrong with academics, but there's all these academics who talk nicely about pedophilia. They call them minor attracted persons. And they say that pedophilia is not the problem, it's acting on it. So they're trying to destigmatize it. As soon as you destigmatize it, of course you normalize it, and of course you're going to encourage more of it. That's how human nature works. If you say, oh, actually it's okay that you're attracted to 10-year-olds, just don't act on it. Well, now people are going to think it's okay to be attracted to 10-year-olds, and of course more are going to act on it, because society isn't providing that stop mechanism, that stigma. We should stigmatize the heck out of it. So I don't agree with any of that at all. But this is rife in academia. Academia is dominated by leftists, and you can't get rid of them because they have tenure. I don't know how that works in Australia. But it's a big problem. We need to make new higher education institutions, because these ones I think are permanently lost.
Hi Chris, thank you for everything you do. I'm a fellow street person who hands out flyers, and I find on the streets of Sydney, I'm not educating people against the dangers of gender ideology, I'm more educating people that it's actually happening here. Most people think it's only happening overseas. And so I first wanted to ask you, you probably do both of those educations wherever you go. What's it been like in Melbourne? Do people know that this is actually happening here? And how do you approach that conversation, rather than, you've spoken a bit about how you approach a conversation to warn people of the dangers, but how do you approach a conversation on telling people it's actually happening here in a way that doesn't overwhelm them? How do you do that?
So in Melbourne, it reminded me a lot of Vancouver when I started almost 4 years ago, back in September 2020. Nobody had a clue what was going on. And I understand it. They looked at me like I had a big hole in my head. Today, it's not like that. Everyone knows what's going on, pretty much. a little bit at least, because the media has talked about it more. But yeah, it was different here. There was a lot less education, so you can show them school materials, you can talk about individual cases that are going on. I mean, it's out there. There's a lot of kids affected by this. I just ran into a whole bunch of them. So people know, I think, this is happening. There was a 13-year-old girl who came to debate me. And I'm not there to talk to little children. So a woman spoke with her. But she was fired up, and she was this militant little social justice warrior, 13 years old, running around the city with other 13-year-olds, no parents. She looked like she was 10, and she's already binding her breasts. I mean, she doesn't really have them, but she's binding them. She's just little. This is outrageous. So in a short span of time, I saw tons of this. So I think people do know what's happening, and there are stories that can be told, and there are Australian cases that can be referenced. And it's in all the schools, so grab some of those school materials and show them, and just feature some of the stories, and get these detransitioners talking. Because, you know, a lot of people don't want to listen to me because I'm just some 6'2" white guy. But they can't deny what these detransitioners are talking about. So their stories need to be told. And from day one, that's always been my biggest focus. Their stories need to be told. That cannot be denied. No one on the left can deny the testimony of Chloe Cole in the United States, who was 15 years old when they cut off her breasts, 13 when they gave her puberty blockers and testosterone. They can't deny Layla Jane, who was 13 years old in 1 month when they cut off her breasts. They can't deny this video of Prisha Mosley that I tweet out all the time. She had borderline personality disorder. She'd been sexually abused. She'd had anorexia. Eating disorders are super common. And she just took the cure that was handed to her, which was a double mastectomy and testosterone. So these stories are here too. And we just need to tell them. Those are the most powerful ones. And that's, I think, the most effective way to do it, because leftist media will even pick up some of those stories more often.
Our website is Defence of Children, and it's from the school curriculum and all the testimonies of the parents, and it's far worse than you know.
Yeah, we just...
And it's everywhere.
And again, it's... With the teachers, most teachers aren't pushing this, because most are still normal. I wouldn't push this, you wouldn't push this, no one in this room as a teacher would push this, but they bring in third-party companies to do sex education. And they're pushing the most radical thing of all. They all do exactly the same all across the Western world. This is straight from the UN Comprehensive Sexuality Education modules, and they're all pushing the most radical things.
Can you mention
yeah.
the fact that there's also the piggybacking on the comprehensive sex education by the third parties, which are usually HIV clinics, gender clinics like ACON, etc. They are doing cradle to the grave marketing to the STD and the PrEP and PEP HIV drugs.
Yeah, it's all connected. And they always combine it too with anti-bullying. So it might not be explicit sexuality instruction, but they weave it into anti-bullying education. And during the anti-bullying education, they'll mention trans or whatever. So all these kids are growing up to just believe that people are trans, the kids are trans. And you get schools now where half the kids say they're LGBTQ. Obviously they're not. But it's cool. It's not cool to be what they call cis, which is just straight. Cis heteronormative. You're part of the oppressor group.
I think they're getting sick of it though, because we've been going around to different schools and they're calling them trans-trenders.
Yeah.
And John Edmondson High School in New South Wales, on the week of Wear It Purple, 50 kids got suspended in that week for pulling down all their LGBTQIA shit.
Yeah. The boys especially aren't having this, but they're all waking up a little bit. It's great. We need to encourage it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned, so you talked about how government agencies are just perpetuating themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the corporate agendas that you've mentioned? And I've read, we talked about that, you talked about that strange millionaire. But I understand there is serious money that's been pumped in, and a lot of this stuff has been astroturfed by billionaires. What do you think their actual agendas are, for those who believe it and those who might be pursuing it for some other cynical reason?
So yes, there's money behind this, but ultimately I would treat this as a quasi-religion, and we have a problem of tens of thousands, perhaps millions across the West of true believers. And I think that's the bigger problem. Yeah, there's money. Yes, surgeons are making money. But it only takes 2 or 3 doctors in each city to harm 1,000 kids. And that's the case. And these people are true believers. If you look at these Boston Children's Hospital videos that I tweeted out a couple years ago, which really started this cascading effect of conservatives looking into all the gender clinics in the United States of America, which led to really 24 states passing legislation to stop this because it was very helpful in educating them. But these doctors at Boston Children's Hospital are true believers. They believe kids are transgender seemingly from the womb, is what she says. And they start seeing them at 2.5 years of age. They'll do social transition because these boys are really effeminate. Oh, they're trans. Really? So, yeah, there's money in it, but the pharmaceutical companies, if you look at Lupron, for example, it's a product of AbbVie Pharmaceuticals, it's making up a very tiny percentage of their revenue. It's not a revenue driver. They're not advertising it. This is really a problem of true believers pushing this all throughout our culture, and you get this cycle going where they educate these high school kids, and then university. There's no women's studies anymore. They're all gender studies. So all the modern day feminists are trans activists. In Melbourne at Federation Square, there was this domestic violence rally going on. I didn't know what was going on. It was a couple hundred yards away from me. But as they filed out, they all walked by me, and these modern day feminists don't know what a woman is. They all hated me, but they loved the man in a dress who was with them. The one man they should worry about in their spaces, because he probably has this fetish called autogynephilia, they're fawning over him and they think I'm the devil. But they've all been indoctrinated. They're not inherently evil, but they've been indoctrinated, and then they get out of university and they become the teachers and the counselors and social workers and the HR employees, which are changing all these corporations. So we just have to break this cycle, and it starts with the education system. We have to get gender identity out of schools, or else we never break this cycle.
I think we might wrap it up unless anyone has burning questions, because Oh, Rowan?
Rachel, just wanted to ask Chris, you mentioned the autogynephilia or whatever it is. It's the girls who are the victims of this.
That's right.
But the perpetrators, the aggressors, are men, and it's a sexual fetish. That's certainly the experience Catherine and I had when we interviewed some for a doco we made that never got screened. What do you say to that?
Yes, so we should talk about this. There's different types of trans. There's what's going on with kids. They're indoctrinated, they're struggling. They have other mental health problems. Then you get these middle-aged adult men who transition. They have a sexual fetish called autogynephilia. Auto, self, gyno, women, philia. It's a sexual fetish. So it literally means attraction to oneself as a woman. And they get aroused by dressing up as a woman. They get aroused by invading women's spaces. You can see these videos on Twitter where you can see they're aroused in these women's spaces. And a lot of them are jerks. A lot of them hate women. They're jealous of women. And now we're telling women that they do womanhood better than actual women. In the United States, 5 girls in high school protested a boy in their shot put. They all got suspended from sports in their state in favor of the boy. So they have this thing called Title IX in the States, which guarantees no discrimination based on sex. You know, girls get to play sports, boys get to play sports. The Biden regime has redefined sex to mean gender identity. So now sex doesn't exist in the law. It's just whatever you want to be. And now the girls who stand up against this because they have no shot beating a man, they're getting kicked out of sports. This is totally outrageous. This is happening here too. There's 5 men on one women's football team.
I'm on him, Chris. I'm on him. I'm coming for him.
Good. We got a journalist here who's coming for him. Lucy. What's your last name, Lucy?
Zelich.
Lucy Zelich. Follow Lucy Zelich.
And bring them to me, and we will bring discrimination to the court.
And we got Catherine Deves who's going to sue them. So we got lawfare is the last thing I haven't mentioned. Lawfare is so important. So finally in the States there's a whole bunch of lawsuits happening. There's one in Canada going on. There are some in the UK going on. Of course there's the Tickle versus Giggle. Oh, it's the best name ever. Tickle is a man wanting onto Giggle, the women's social network, and Catherine Deves is helping to take this eventually to the High Court where we can get a proper definition for woman. But lawfare is important. There's a law firm in the United States, in Texas. 4 dads left their previous law firms and they all started a new one just to represent these kids because they felt called to do it. They have 17 kids between them. There's a million ways they could have made money as a lawyer, but this is what they're doing. So they have several lawsuits going on. One of those lawsuits is against the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics. I know these guys, they're awesome. But they're able to sue the AAP because there's a doctor named Jason Rafferty in Rhode Island who was involved in the case of a girl who was harmed. She's now suing him. And Jason Rafferty wrote the policy statement that the AAP is currently using. So now they're able to also link in the AAP. And this is big, even for Australia, because we're all connected. And when this goes to court, and they have to bring their evidence to justify transitioning children, they don't have it. As the Cass review reveals, as all of these systematic reviews reveal, they don't have the evidence. And it doesn't matter if they win or lose in the first court case, it'll go to appeals. And eventually this will end up in the Supreme Court. And so lawfare is extremely important. And when the AAP is found guilty, is found negligent, is shown to have nothing to back up what they're doing, that will reverberate all across the world. And I said on this interview with Rita Panahai the other day, right now the authorities in Australia are trying to ignore the evidence. But when an avalanche of truth is hitting them and they're buried under it, they can't ignore it any longer. And even all these leftist politicians won't be able to ignore it. They're just going to virtue signal until the very last moment they can before they'll have to save face somehow and say, oh gosh, new evidence has come to light. We'd better stop doing this. And that's exactly how it's going to happen. But support the lawyers because that's the quickest way to get this done.
I was going to ask you to finish on a positive note, but I think that that's actually pretty positive, the fact that there is an avalanche of truth coming. And I know we spoke before about the harms of social media in this gender ideology movement, especially to young girls, but I don't think social media is evil in and of itself, and the work that you're doing via social media is absolutely incredible. You're reaching millions of people all around the world, which is even more needed at a time where in countries like Australia we don't really have media diversity. Like, we've obviously got some great conservative journalists who are doing incredible work at Sky, The Australian, TNT Radio and others, and some of those people are here tonight. But social media is where we get a lot of cut through, especially with young people, and even the journalists on the left, they see that as well. So it's incredibly important. So thank you so much for all that you're doing.